Okay, I think we can start. Welcome everybody. My name is Lorenzo Forni. I'm the head of Prometeia Associazione, and I welcome you to this webinar. The title is 2024 European Elections, Charting the Course for Europe's Future. Now, as you know, in 3 months' time, we will have European election from the 6th to the 9th of June. And let me welcome my guests that I, first of all, thank very much. They are very qualified to talk about these issues. I'm very happy they were so kind to join us. So first of all, Catherine Fieschi. Thank you, Catherine. Catherine is fellow at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University. She has held many positions in academics and think tanks. And I would say she's an expert of, let's say, the rising populism, I guess, in Europe and across the world. Then we have Erik Jones. Hi, Erik. Erik is the director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute as well. He was before at the John Hopkins University SAIS Europe, which is the School of Advanced International Studies, which actually is based in Bologna. He has written extensively on European politics, governance, and economics. And as I told my guests, my introduction of them is going to be short because I am an economist. I'm not a political scientist, and I don't want to make, mistakes or stress something they are not proud of. And then we have Filippo Andreatta, who is professor of international relations at the University of Bologna. He has written extensively on European issues and international politics. Filippo has been also our guest in other webinars, and so I guess you already know him pretty well. So thank you so much. The plan for today, we have an hour and a half. We will start by Catherine. Catherine is going to lay out what she thinks is the current, let's say, political landscape in Europe ahead of the European elections. What the polls are currently suggesting, what is the likelihood of a change in majority at the next elections. Then we will have a roundtable, and I encourage all the listeners to submit questions during the webinar. I think it's going to be better, so we will have more time to process them and to pass them over to our guest speakers. Then Erik Jones is going to discuss what he thinks are going to be the priority for the next European Commission agenda. What are the, let's say, the current plans that probably are going to get into some trouble, while others might be, easier to bring forward. So get a sense of what might change, at the European level in terms of the next Commission policies. And then Filippo Andreatta will set the situation of the European politics within the international context. So, which is going to be very complicated, what is happening in the US, what is happening in Eastern Europe, it's going to affect a lot what Europe will be able and will have to do in the future. So I'm very eager to learn a lot today. I hope I didn't forget anything. Let me start to give right away the floor to Catherine. Catherine, just to warm up, I'm a little bit surprised that there's so much discussion in the media about a possible second Trump term in the United States, while it appears that, there's much less discussion about, the European election, which actually are coming, before the US ones. And, there is a risk of some increase in the populist right or some change in majority. Why do you think there is less discussion currently about the European election than the American ones, even in Europe, I would say?
So I think that's a really good question, and I guess I have a sort of a two-part answer. The first part of the answer is bracketing the fact that because this is what I work on. I have a feeling that all I'm doing is talking about the European elections, and I am surrounded by people who are interested. But this may very well be a bias on my part, and in terms of the people that I interact with, such as yourselves. But I think that there are two important points. And one point here is that I think even for Europeans, and particularly as we've just gone through Super Tuesday in the United States, I think that even for Europeans, there is a sense in which the European elections are extremely important, but there is a sense in which everything is overshadowed by the possibility of a second Trump term. So I think that the United States elections, the American elections, tend to maybe suck the air out a little bit. But I also think it's important in this respect, in terms of the question you pose, which is that I do think that the American elections are having an impact in the way in which we are discussing these European elections. So it's not so much that they're absent, but I do think that, the possibility of a second Trump term has heightened our awareness of, what the kind of unpredictability, the kind of problems that growing populist power can mean. And therefore, I do think that the American elections are coloring the way in which we are talking about the European elections, and particularly the way that we're talking about the possible successes of the far right and the populist right. So I think that, it's not so much that it's one or the other, but I do really think that there is an interesting dynamic between the two of them. And it's probably a first in terms of European elections, that the American elections might be overshadowing them and creating certain frameworks of reference.
Sure. Should I share your slides on Europe now?
Yes, sure. That would be great. Thank you.
Can you see them?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Right. If we could go to the second one, that would be great.
Sure.
Thank you. Great. Shall I dive in then?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
So let's see what to expect from this coming election. Should we be concerned or not too much?
Great. Okay. Well, as I was just saying, I think that we tend to we've tended to focus, and I think quite rightly, on the possibility of significant gains on the part of the far right and the populist right in these elections in early June. So I thought that what I would do is maybe present some of the predicted results, and I'm using mainly the numbers from Europe Elects, who did their most recent polling, or rather released their most recent polling on March 5th. So these are very fresh data. And I thought that we would look a little bit at, who wins, who loses, and perhaps, I think most importantly, how this will matter for the shape of the European Parliament to come. So I think it's worth remembering that the last time the far right and the populist right, they did well, but they didn't do as well as they had expected to do. Those who really gained seats were the liberal centrists, the Renew group, and the Greens. And so if we look at slide number one gives us a very good an idea of the state of the current Parliament. And you can see from this slide that it's actually very balanced here. It's almost cut down the middle, with the right at almost 50%, and then the Liberals, the Greens, and the center left on the other side. This time, though, there is talk of a great far right and populist wave, to such an extent that I've even heard comments about whether the far right will win the elections, right? And in many respects, this formulation is nonsense in the context of the European Parliament elections. But the risk is real. The very real risk is that these parties will come in first or second in a number of key countries. And by that, I mean countries that are both at the heart of the European Union project and also who send a great number of MEPs to Brussels, countries like France, Germany, and Italy. And these, in the far right or populist right parties in these countries are going to boost the numbers of the people of the ECR, the European Conservative and Reformist Group, who are the sort of populist sovereignists in the European Parliament, but they will also boost the numbers of the other group, Identity and Democracy, which is slightly more which is further to the right and potentially more marked by its very strident anti-immigration stance. So I think there's not a lot of guesswork really going on here. The far right and the populist right parties have done very well of late in some countries. We know that they lead the coalition in Italy. They are the largest opposition force and pulling way ahead of Macron in France. Macron is on 19%. Marine Le Pen and her party are on 28 or 29%. And we also know that they have been gathering steam and making headlines with the AfD in Germany. So there is no reason why these domestic successes wouldn't translate into real gains at the European Parliament level. In particular, given that voters across Europe, as we know, have often thought of European Parliament elections as second-order elections. In other words, elections where they feel have less direct consequences for them, and therefore elections during which they can sort of either have a go at the incumbents or have a rant and confirm their rage. So if the chips fall where they are predicted to fall, and I think that we know that generally the polling is relatively accurate in the European Parliament elections. Let's see what we're likely to see. So could I ask you to go to the bar graph?
Yes, Catherine. Before we go,
Sure.
we go to that. Can you just, some of us are not entirely familiar to all these political formations and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say, which are the parties that you would define far right or populist right? So you mentioned the European Conservative and Reformists and also the Identity and Democracy. So I guess that in this chart that we are looking at, it's the blue, the 58 European Conservative and Reformists are the light blue color, and the Identity and Democracy, I'm not sure which one is that.
So the black dots are the Identity and Democracy, and I would probably put those in the those we might qualify for the sake of distinction as more far right parties. So in that group, this is the black dots all the way to the right. And I think, in that group, what the people you'll find are the Austrian Freedom Party. They are the Italian Lega, led by Salvini. They are.
That's why the title of this black is Salvini's European Alliance.
That's right, because Salvini leads the group. The European Conservative and Reformists are actually not the very light blue; they're the one over. They are the sort of they're the third group from the right, and they are the European conservative and reformists. And in the European conservative and reformists, you find Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy. You find the Sweden Democrats, and also you find the Polish PIS party. And just, in order for our listeners to understand the difference between them, you could argue that while the identity and democracy are extremely Eurosceptic and have often advocated leaving the European Union, what you have with the European conservative and reformists are actually people who aren't necessarily intent on leaving the European Union, but rather in trying to reshape it into, a kind of a collection of sovereign states that simply collaborate in an ad hoc manner. So they are, very much anti-federalist, but not necessarily completely Eurosceptic.
Let me ask you another question. The European People's Party, which is, the other big chunk on the right. What are the relationship between the European People's Party and these other parties more on the right? So can you tell us something? Because maybe it's far-fetched to think that they can go along together easily.
Well, so this is, I think, exactly what is at stake in these coming European elections, right? If we think of the possible results, and here I will answer that question, but I think it's important to see to answer your question quickly now. The European People's Party, so the center right, for a long time were also the home of Fidesz, of Hungary's Orban. So this gives us a clue as to the fact that they are actually, perfectly amenable to welcoming into the European People's Party's home somebody who is, very much, a sovereignist and very much a Eurosceptic. But Fidesz was suspended and then kicked out. Nevertheless, it's important to know that certainly in the past year, the European People's Party has been amenable to working in particular with the European conservative and reformists, especially with respect to some of the Green Deal policies. So we know that even though they are separate parties, there is the possibility of collaborating. And I think that, one of the reasons people are worried about the election results for this coming June is that they imagine that a larger ECR group might be a very tempting partner for the European People's Party, and we might therefore see more collaboration between the two. But I think that I can say a little bit more about this if we look a little bit at what we think that the results might be. So if you could potentially put the slide with the bar graphs on it, that would be super helpful.
Is this one?
Exactly. Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. So I think that this slide is, as I said, very much the latest predictions. And what you can see here is, without going into too much detail, because I don't necessarily think we have the time, is that the solid bottom parts of each bar graph are essentially where the parties stand now, And then, you know, the top part of the bar graph shows us the expected gains or losses, as the case may be, on a party-to-party basis. One of the things that we can see is that actually the two main groups, the European People's Party and the Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, actually remain largely stable, right? They don't stand to lose or gain very many seats. They will remain the two main parties, and you know, and it's important to say this because some of the discussions of these elections might lead one to believe that somehow, you know, the far right and the populist right, you know, might be bigger than everything else. That is not the case. The European People's Party and the Socialists and Democrat will retain the largest number of seats. What we do see is two other important points. One is that we're going to have some significant losers in these elections. So the people who had made, the groups that had made significant gains last time, the Liberals in particular, and the Greens, you know, stand to lose seats this time around. And so in that respect,
sorry, Catherine, the Liberals would be Renew Europe, right?
the Liberals are Renew Europe, yes.
Yes. Okay.
Exactly, and the Green European Alliance, and you can see that they both stand to lose. They both stand to lose seats, which means on the one hand that the sort of the left part of the European Parliament stands to be a little bit weakened, and that the Liberals, who were a very good centrist alliance partner with whom to make ad hoc alliances on different policy issues, will carry less power. The second important point, of course, is what we're supposed to be talking about here today, which is the fact that both Identity and Democracy and the European Conservatives and Reformists stand to make relatively significant gains. So what's important here is that if I could ask you to show the other semicircle, that's it, that semicircle graph. What we see here, and I think is really important, is that we don't see a major revolutionary shift, right? It's not as if all of a sudden the European Parliament is overrun by the far right and the populist right. But what we do notice is that the right-leaning part of the European Parliament has become ever so slightly dominant, right? And we can see that it's going over more than 50%. This is really important because even though it's not a major numerical shift, it's actually potentially a very important shift in terms of the kinds of alliances that we're going to see emerge and the kinds of deals that we're going to see emerge between these different party groups.
Can you say something, tell us something about what do you think under such a scenario, assuming this would be the outcome, which of course we are not sure. Yeah. What do you think could be the possible coalitions that would somehow confront themselves in the future European Parliament? And what should we expect for the Commission? So if you can, in a
yeah. So I'll be quick on this. I think that the first important point here, and I will leave the bulk of the discussion of the Commission to Erik, but I think the first important point here is that given the way that these seats will be arranged and given past behavior, we know that the EPP, the European People's Party, will be likely to make more ad hoc alliances with the European Conservative and Reformists. And we know that this probably spells trouble, especially for climate policy, where they sort of agree on delaying and, you know, they have a sort of more climate relativistic stance. Bearing in mind also that as we speak today, but also yesterday, the EPP was holding its program conference in Bucharest, and they have released a manifesto or a party, a group program that is very anti-immigration, very anti-climate. Now, this may be in part electioneering to try and capture some of the right-wing populist voters. And there are, of course, there's real nuances between the parties that make up this EPP. But the fact is that we are seeing not just a bigger slice of the parliament go right, we are also seeing the center right move to the right itself, right? So as I said, here we're likely to find ourselves faced with a parliament, and the commission is likely to find itself faced with a parliament that is far less convinced of a kind of a Europeanization, be it in terms of industrial policy, be it in terms of the Green Deal. There's going to be a return to more sovereignist positions. This is one of the very real dangers. And I think that the other very significant point, not with respect to the Commission, but with respect to domestic politics, I think that this shift in the European Parliament will have an impact at the domestic level. If these parties do well in the European elections, it creates a dynamic whereby they are reinforced at the national level. So, we might see, first of all, more polarization inside the European Parliament. If the right is not just more important numerically, but it's also further to the right, the possibility of the usual consensus between the center left and the center right starts to become much more difficult to entertain. So, we would be in this situation where we're importing the national level polarization in some ways into the European Parliament, and then the European Parliament dynamics might reinforce the polarization at the domestic level. So I think that, just to conclude on this, what's important again is not really the fact that we have an increase of about 20% in terms of the far right and the populist right. I mean, that's not good news, but I don't think that's the issue. The issue is that it really shifts the balance, and it's going to make consensus and alliances with the Liberals, the Greens, and the SPD, which much more difficult than they have been in the past, and therefore a European Parliament that is much more sovereignist or has much more sovereignist actors at its heart. And that is not so much a huge change with respect to the past, but a very big change with respect to what we've seen in the past 5 years and the way that the European Union has dealt with, some of the major crises. I'm not sure that this kind of consensus will be available in the next European Parliament. And I'll stop here, but I'm happy to answer questions.
But I have a couple of very quick follow-up questions. I mean, at the end of the day, there is going to be a coalition within the European Parliament that has to vote for a commission.
Yeah.
Where do you think, given this layout of possible of the outcome in terms of the European Parliament, how do you think, which one do you think is going to be this coalition? And then I have a second question, which is, European election are voted using a proportional system, or for any other reason, you think that in European election, far right parties can gain more votes than national type of election for any reason? Maybe because Europe is more distant, you send a message, or because it's proportional, you are less worried about the outcomes, or I don't know. I have these two questions, if you can help me.
Sure. So I think starting with your second one, I think for a long time, European elections were precisely where these parties tended to have their first successes, right? It tended to be easier for them precisely because of proportional representation. So they would get just a few seats, but they got their foot in the door. I think that, and the fact that, yes, they were more distant, I think really people used them to vent, right? To send a message. And it was, the received wisdom, and it's still partly true, right? But the received wisdom was that actually the European elections were 27 or 28, as the case might have been before, very separate national elections, that there was really nothing that European about them. People voted on domestic stances, and they voted potentially with more abandon, if you like. I'm not entirely sure that this holds as much now. I think that, Europe has become a more visible actor, certainly post-COVID, but now also with respect to to environmental policy, and I think also now with respect to the Russian war against Ukraine. I think that European issues are starting to be taken more seriously. However, I think that, these parties now don't just have a few seats, they are on some of the key committees, for example, they play an active role. So I think these votes are more serious now, right? Not only easier to get, but also probably I think they are more serious votes rather than fantastical votes as they might have been in the past. I think in terms of which coalition, it's quite clear that in terms of the election, the election of the president of the Commission, von der Leyen has just been made the Spitzenkandidat of the EPP. She's been also she is being backed by Emmanuel Macron. She is being backed by people like Giorgia Meloni, which basically means that the ECR and the Liberals, all of these parties are essentially ready to back her, and I would imagine that will be absolutely sufficient. So I also think it's worth saying that the manifesto that the EPP have come up with is I mean, it's a paradox that they've endorsed Ursula von der Leyen, who has been pushing forward actually a very cohesive Europe, Europe as a power, a geopolitical Europe, the recovery package, the Green Deal, and the manifesto that the EPP have put together goes against all of these things, right? So that gives us a sense that this manifesto is pure electoral posturing. They want to try and see if they can get some of those votes from the populist, the voters inclined to vote for populist parties.
So after all, you don't expect a change in the composition of the majority supporting the Commission overall, but with a little shift in priorities, at least for the European People's Party.
I expect an alliance and a cohesiveness behind Ursula von der Leyen's election. I think afterwards, in terms of acting to, being able to act together on some key issues, the budget, enlargement, and the Green Deal, here I think that there is going to be, much more of a problem coming from the European Parliament.
Okay, Catherine, I'll thank you so much. I'll stop you here and I'll move to Erik, which is actually going to discuss about this. So Erik, let me give you the floor and tell us, given these projections, how do you think the agenda of the next Commission is going to change? First of all, do you agree that von der Leyen has a good chances of being the next president of the Commission?
So, Lorenzo, I'm gonna tell you something that is gonna help resolve some of the issues that you and Catherine have been discussing, because I could hear in your voice one piece of misunderstanding that's probably common for everyone in our audience. The Parliament at the European level does not work like a national parliament. It will have one vote to support the Commission. Prior to that, though, and much more important, it will have one vote to support the President of the European Parliament. And the coalition that supports that president never has to reappear again. And it will have one vote to support the commission, and that coalition never has to appear again. And each time it goes to vote on legislation, a different coalition will form from different groups depending on what the issue is. And so there's no necessary coalition glue that has to bind it together, right?
Oh, Erik, thank you. This is an important clarification. That was probably my mistake, but yeah, I was
Very common mistake. No parliament works this way, right?
Yeah.
But see, as the European Parliament has gained more and more legislative responsibility, the fact that it doesn't need stable coalitions has forced analysts like Catherine and me pay much more attention to who goes into the European Parliament on an issue-by-issue basis, right? Because the attitudes of a very small group on a particular issue could be decisive. And I'll give you an illustration. Ursula von der Leyen got into the commission because the five-star movement decided to support her when she came up for a vote in June of 2019. The five-star movement has not supported her since then. But at that particular moment, they were a crucial part of building her coalition. And that's what created the divisions between the five-star movement and the Lega in the yellow-green coalition that culminated in at the end of that summer when Salvini pulled the plug on the government, right?
Yeah, I mean, this sounds a little bit weird to me that, the commission, you get a president and then there's no coalition supporting this president for the entire term of the commission. But probably it's not the time to get into that now.
But it's important to know when I talk through the legislative agenda,
Yes.
right? Because what you should know is that it's going to have a different impact on each piece of the legislative agenda, right?
Yes, correct.
And so let's think about it, right? When von der Leyen brought her commission into Parliament in 2019, she established 6 headline priorities, right? She said she wants the Green Deal. She wants an economy that works for the people. She wants a Europe fit for the digital age. She wants to protect the European way of life. She wants a stronger Europe in the world. And she wants a new push for European democracy. If you look at the 6 points that Charles Michel has set out as the framework for the strategic agenda that he will have adopted by the European Council in June of 2024, it's the same 6 things, right? He's got slightly different ways of describing them. He puts different priorities on them, but it's the same package of 6, right? I'm not going to say 6-pack because then European jargon, that means something completely different. So let's just say package of 6, right? Now,
Exactly.
okay. I think what you should know, and this is what Catherine was trying to emphasize, the first thing, the Green Deal, whatever Ursula von der Leyen managed to achieve in this commission is all we're going to get. We are not going to get any more ambitious climate legislation in the next 5 years. Full stop, right? Why? Because the EPP, which has turned against aggressive climate action, will form an alliance with all of the parties to the right to block climate action.
Sorry, Erik, that doesn't mean that what is already approved is not going to go forward. So
That's right. So we get what we got, but don't expect any more, right?
no, because they could walk back also a lot of legislation that has already been approved.
So this is a more challenging question, right? Because in order to put a new piece of legislation up that rolls back this, you have to get the College of Commissioners to agree on the legislative proposal. You'd have to get the council to agree on the legislative proposal. Then you'd have to get the parliament to agree on the legislative proposal. think that's likely to happen, right? But what the commission could do is very quietly try to make sure the implementation of what legislation has passed takes place without provoking such an outcry that we overcome those obstacles, right? And that's why it's good that the farmers are protesting now and not 12 months from now, right? We want the farmers to protest now. We want to deal with that protest now and come up with any accommodation now so that when we start doing the implementation of all of this climate legislation, it'll be easier. I think where we're going to run into trouble is with the phasing out of internal combustion engines, right? Because there, I think the commission is going to have to discover inner flexibility in the implementation of the rules, because there's no way we're going to shut down the whole of the German automotive sector between now and 2035, right? So in that sense, I think what we're going to look for is healthy dose of pragmatism on the part of the incoming commission. And we're going to look for where we can actually move constructive legislation inside the parliament. And we're not going to move constructive legislation inside the parliament in the climate space. Right?
Got it.
So this is why when Catherine introduced this issue, it was not with a note of yay, it was like, oh no, what are we going to do next, right? We said that let's take stock, right? You know, we've got the biodiversity rules, we've got the Green New Deal, we've got a lot of stuff out there that's, and we've got Next Generation EU, which is financing a lot of that green infrastructure, right? So we've got the Critical Materials Act, so we've got stuff in place that's going to help. And I think in terms of, you know, from an investment perspective, I think you can see real opportunities coming out of that because the structural transformation is underway, right? I just don't think the smart bet would be on more ambitious policies following, because that's what Ursula von der Leyen wanted in 2019. She is going to have to water that down. And the fact that she's embracing this agenda that Catherine described, that the EPP put forward, so she's in Bucharest right now embracing this agenda, is already a sign that she's willing to walk back from her more ambitious positions, right? And that is a very clear impact of the European elections.
Okay, so we slow down or stop. I mean, of course, there is an European climate law, so I guess there are still targets that the European legal system has to somehow embed in legislation. So anyway, where are we going to make any progress instead, if not on climate?
You will remember the Juncker Commission, and the Juncker Commission was very aggressive on smart regulation, right? And critics of the Juncker Commission argued that what the Juncker Commission practiced was a policy of deregulation through inaction, right? So it slowed down by doing lots of impact assessments. It slowed down the process of regulation in areas like chemicals, food safety, and all the rest, right? And I think we're going to see a lot more of that, because that's going to be a lot easier for the commission to do as a legislative agenda, is to say, look, we're doing smart regulation. If you look at the commission's work program for 2024, what you'll see is they put up front how much money has been saved through smart regulation, through simplifying regulation, through ensuring that no new regulation is added without old regulation being taken away, right? And you know, obviously, as a political scientist, I tend to lean to the left and to the big government side, and I think regulation is a good thing. But I have to admit that there are lots of situations where that may not be the case. In the business community, there's a large constituency that believes that new regulation is not a good thing. And I think what we're going to see is less bad regulation in the next commission, and that's probably a good thing, right?
This term, smart regulation, is a technical term, is a term that you guys in political science use, or is a
No, it's the way that the Juncker Commission sold
the
this
Juncker
idea,
Commission? Okay.
and it's a kind of language that has been. I mean, nobody wants dumb regulation, but it's a kind of language that's used in the policy world to sort of suggest that what we're doing is we're being very thoughtful about how we're going to regulate, how much we're going to regulate, and how we're going to introduce the regulatory process. Catherine, please come in and help me here.
No, I just also think that smart in this context is very much about simple, easy to apply. It really is about being concise as opposed to being legally verbose, which, let's face it, I'm a fan of regulation too, but right now people are drowning in verbose over-regulation.
So we're going to get a commission that looks a lot more like Juncker, right? And a lot less like von der Leyen Mark I, right? I think that would be my second takeaway.
I'm just trying to remember whether the Juncker Commission achieved anything at the European. I don't remember.
If you want to take the critics at their word, yeah, he achieved a significant amount of deregulation, because a lot of regulations that would have been introduced by a different commission did not happen, right?
Okay, please go ahead. Yeah.
So then you have to go to what they call an economy that works, right? An economy that works for the European people. There's very little on the social agenda that this next commission is going to push out, right? So there's going to be very little forceful effort to try to harmonize social policy. And instead, and you can see this very clearly being signposted in the 2024 work package, there's going to be a lot more emphasis on capital markets union, trying to do the heavy lifting on insolvency regulation across different member states, try to do greater efforts to make it easier for firms at ever smaller sizes to access private capital markets rather than having to go through bank intermediation, and try to make cross-border investing more attractive again, right? And I think this new European Parliament will be much more amenable to that.
Why is that? I mean, which interest this is gonna reflect? I mean, open up the markets, even if it is in cross-border investing or capital market union, implies opening up national markets. And so maybe parties that are nationalistic don't like this, or what am I wrong?
So let me just put this into the Italian context, right? And in the Italian context, whatever we might think about the social policies of the Lega and the social policies of Fratelli d'Italia, the one thing we know is that they both share an interest in attracting the core constituency of the small to medium-sized industrial sector in the north, right? And you go to those guys, and what do they want? They want better access to capital markets, right? They want some way to get a lower cost of capital. And then you start bringing the insurance companies in. The insurance companies want a much easier way to diversify their portfolio of assets. And both of those things are made possible through capital markets union. So it's something that's complicated enough that that you don't have to worry about it becoming a big mass popular political issue, and it's targeted enough that it will appeal to core constituencies that are traditionally aligned with the center right.
Makes sense.
And the other side of this is banking union, right? Now, banking union is important because we actually are still in a situation where national competent authorities responsible for regulating financial institutions don't want financial institutions to port assets or liabilities across national borders because they don't trust banks in other countries. And part of that has to do with the lack of a meaningful resolution framework. And part of it has to do with the lack of a common deposit insurance scheme. And I think she's going to push ahead on both of those things, strengthening the resolution framework, strengthening the financing of the resolution framework, and doing a review of deposit insurance to see what kind of a common backstop can be stuck on that, right?
Let's not talk about the European Stability Mechanism.
We won't.
We will.
We won't discuss the love that has no name, right?
Okay, exactly.
But you see the emphasis there is really on making it easier for business to flourish. It's a very much a right-wing agenda though, because it's all supply side. It's not going to be about, you know, the markets and labor markets and labor market protections and all that stuff, which, let's be honest, the last von der Leyen commission, the one that we're in right now, actually did put an accent on and tried to pay attention to, and is not paying attention to it anymore, and we shouldn't expect to see it after these elections, right?
Okay.
Okay. A Europe fit for the digital age. You know, what do we expect to see there? I mean, you know, Europe has been doing some really interesting stuff in terms of digital regulation. The AI Act is the first effort to regulate artificial intelligence by any major regulatory authority. I think that kind of innovation will be less aggressive, and instead the shift will be to focus more on industrial policy in the digital space. So less on regulation, more on tech industries, more on completing next generation EU and the digital transformation that it's supposed to finance.
When you talk about industrial policy, you mean subsidies or?
You know, I mean, industrial policy goes by many different names, but let's not forget in September of 2019, when Ursula von der Leyen wrote her commissioning letter to Margrethe Vestager, and she put digital sovereignty as a main theme, right? And I think that digital sovereignty main theme is going to come back, but with a strong reinforcement. And it's going to have to do with manufacturing. It's going to have to do with platforms. It's going to have to do with the whole protection of data. And it's going to have to do with the industries that Europe can develop to ensure that these things are secure, right? And you see it popping up not just in this digital space, but you'll see it popping up again in the security domain, because cybersecurity and data security are two themes that run through the commission, right? And that's going to be very prominent in the next iteration as well.
Okay, so now we are at point 4, European Union way of life.
Protecting the European way of life. This is going to be the problem, right? When they say protecting the European way of life, they mean two different conversations. One is about migration, where this commission is going to be very aggressive in trying to make sure that migrants are processed as close to the border or outside the border, right? And the other has to do with rule of law. And the reason that it's odd is because I think we're going to see far less commentary about rule of law. I think we're going to make peace with Slovakia and with Hungary and with the relative failings in Poland that will be almost impossible to erase. And while there will be voices on the left that will challenge this position by the Commission, we're not going to see somebody like Frans Timmermans who is driving that agenda as aggressively, right? I think that's a pity, but let's face it, it's also consistent with the new enlargement strategy, because as much as they're going to try to ensure the rule of law is protected in these accession countries, letting off the rule of law debate is going to be key to making sure the enlargement actually takes place, right? So, a stronger Europe in the world. And,
Number
here I
five.
don't want
We are at 5 out of 6, right?
yeah, a stronger Europe in the world. Now, here I don't want to step on Filippo's train. This is an area where he and I have interacted very closely in the past. What this is a reference to is not just having a common foreign and security policy, but much more important, having a defense industry that can supply the requirements for a European security and defense identity. And there we see a clear point of tension between what Emmanuel Macron wants, which is for everything to be domestic, and what a lot of the Nordic countries want, which is to buy American kit because it's freely available and it's ready now, right? I think we're going to move into Macron's direction, and this is where Macron's relationship with von der Leyen is going to become important because because she will lean more heavily into buy local on the defense industrial side. But I think Filippo will have more to say about that. That's just my intuition, right? There's also going to be a bit more of a challenge in this stronger Europe in the world with respect to the way sanctions are processed and sanctions legislation is moved. We're going to rely even more on sanctions than we have in the past. And finally, I think this is where we're going to see tension between Europe and the United States. So strategic autonomy is going to emerge in this place as we debate again about how much Europe should be dominated by American industrial policy and industrial policy considerations.
I mean, guys, I'm learning a lot, but what I'm seeing here, and then I let you finish, sorry, Erik, but this is kind of a mega agenda. So make Europe great again, not a MAGA agenda, make America great again. I mean, this seems like a Trump kind of agenda. So it's pro-market, strategic autonomy, anti-immigration, forget climate. I see a lot of similarities. And but I mean, please do finish with the 6th point, and then maybe you have to add something else. But be mindful also of the time.
The 6th point is very easy. So making Europe, this push for European democracy was about reinforcing the Spitzenkandidat and the lead candidates and the democratization of Europe. I don't think the democratization of Europe is going to make any progress because what we're instead going to be focused on is preparing the European institutions for enlargement. And the fact that von der Leyen is participating in this lead candidate process by taking the nomination of the EPP, I do not regard as an embrace of European democracy. On the contrary, I think this is almost the tombstone for the whole idea of having a lead candidate, right? Because she was not appointed by the EPP to begin with, right? She's only using the EPP because it's convenient, and they're using her because it's convenient too, right? So
Right.
I'm uncomfortable with that. So but I do think there will be an institutional reform agenda that we cannot escape, that comes from enlargement and that is completely orthogonal to democracy, right? If anything, it's going to be much more about efficiency and resilience in the institutional arrangements. And we have to look
This
at
is very,
how that develops.
This is not very clear. Do you want to add anything on the EU budget or?
The EU budget, I had 3 things that I think we should look at. One is the search for own resources. You talked about that earlier with the carbon border adjustment mechanism. We need to find own resources, if only to avoid having the repayment of next generation EU eat up all of the headroom in the European budget. The headroom is the gap between the money that's allocated by the member states and the amount of actual spending that takes place. And we need that headroom for flexibility. But right now, it seems that's the only resource that we have to repay next generation EU. As they do that, the second thing is going to be more common borrowing. You're seeing a lot of pressure both to meet the defense obligations that I suggested in making Europe stronger in the world, and and to finance other quote unquote European public goods, to borrow from Marco Butti. And I think we're going to have to debate this. Whether we actually end up with more common borrowing or not remains to be seen, but it must be debated, right?
But do you think the next European Parliament would be leaning more towards this idea of European common goods or less?
I think they will lean toward it on the defense side. I don't want to say in the context of helping Ukraine, but certainly in the context of facilitating adequate military procurement, particularly if Donald Trump becomes the next president, right?
Yeah. So this would be a very good moment to stop and to pass the floor. If you're done, Erik, not sure.
I have one more thing, but I can
Okay.
hold on.
No. Please go ahead now, because you mentioned Ukraine, and of course.
No. I just wanted to say one last thing, which is that we
Yeah.
have to revisit the common agricultural policy.
Oh, yeah.
We will have to do that in the next 5 years, right? So
That's gonna be tough.
that's a big thing, right?
Sorry?
And that's a big thing.
That's a big thing.
Yeah.
Okay, Erik, thank you so much. Really, you gave us a broad perspective on a number of issues. It's going to be very interesting to see how, the next European Parliament is going to follow up on this. There's going to be debates on any of these issues. Filippo, the floor is yours. Ukraine has been mentioned, and of course, it's one of the elephant in the room, I guess, or the elephant.
I will turn to Ukraine in a minute, but since
Okay.
we are making scenarios, I actually think that what Catherine and Erik have suggested is a most likely scenario of, but it's not the only possibility. There is some chance that despite the fact that the far-right parties will gain seats, there will be no real discontinuity in the Commission. I'll return, I'll share a few slides myself, but
Please.
okay, returning to the projected Parliament, I really see no alternative if this is the actual result, which we don't know.
Sorry, Filippo, can you put in the broader, what's called, in presentation mode, if you can?
I suppose.
That's okay. If you...
Okay.
Great.
Is it better?
That's perfect.
This is exactly from Europe Elects, the poll of polls of what the expected outcome would be. And I really see no real alternative, if this is the turnout, for a new von der Leyen mandate based on the alliance, which is basically the same as today, between the People's Party in light blue, the Liberals in yellow, and the Socialists in red. If these are the results, I think there will be, for the election of the Commission, basically there is no alternative for this choice. It's also that it's true that the European People's Party has an interest in having alternatives on certain legislation and dropping the left for a different kind of majority, but that there are national dynamics which are against that. If you think, for example, that in the European People's Party, one of the most important politicians today is the Polish Prime Minister, he certainly has a problem with ECR, which is the main enemy at the national level. The same Macron with Le Pen, the Partido Popular in Spain with Vox, certainly the CDU in Germany has a problem with the Alternative for Deutschland, which means that it is likely to be difficult to have something organic. It may be ad hoc, certainly might happen, but there might be a chance that things continue. Also because, as Erik has already mentioned, there may be events outside Europe which require Europe to react and force Europe actually to react, especially in two sectors. The first has been mentioned, which is the defense industry and the military cooperation supporting Ukraine. The other is energy. I'm talking about not the Green Deal. I'm talking about the heating and the electricity, which everything else requires. Because the two big events on which this will depend are, of course, the American elections and the outcome of the Ukraine-Russia war. And as for the American election, it's a bit early to say, but it is a fact that the President Biden's approval ratings are historically low for an election year. The incumbent president, in my memory, has never been below 40% in approval rating, and it has been consistently so, which is strange because the economy is doing very well. And in fact, as the election comes closer, Biden's chances might be improved because the electorate actually starts understanding and feeling that the economy is doing well. But at this time, I would say that there is at least a 50% chance of a second Trump term in terms of polling. This is a projection of the poll of polls in terms of states, and you can see that there is a slight advantage for Republicans, according to polls taken now, updated to these days, 235 electoral votes to 226, yes, and basically, as increasingly is becoming presidential elections, everything will depend on a few key swing states, in particular the 6 ones, which are neither red nor blue. All these 6 went to the Democrats in 2020, but now they are undecided. And some have some single issues which may become problematic for Biden. Generally, foreign policy is not very important at elections, especially in the United States. But, for example, the quite intense minority of Arab Americans in Michigan which is a natural democratic vote, but is upset by American policy in the Middle East, may be problematic and may lose Michigan, which is the second largest or the third largest of the swing states. So it is a very close call. It is impossible now to predict. And the Ukraine war is very difficult to predict. So to make it simple, I will just play with 4 scenarios according to how these 2 variables go, the American elections and the Ukraine war. And of course, they can only go 2 ways. There is some endogeneity, as you economists would say, because of course, if Trump wins, there is a higher probability that Russia prevails in the war. If Biden wins, there is a slighter, higher probability that Ukraine prevails. Of course, the best scenario for Europe would be that Biden wins and Ukraine prevails. This would allow Europe not to do much because more or less the main threats to the West and to the East are sorted out. Okay. The worst scenario is the one on the bottom right. If Trump wins and abandons Europe, and if Russia prevails and threatens Europe, Europe will be in such a deep geopolitical trouble that it will be forced to do what Erik said and start doing a next generation EU all over again on defense. Okay, we're talking about doubling from 1.5% of GDP to 3% of GDP military expenditure in Europe over the next 5 years.
Filippo, sorry, let me interrupt you just for a second. Can you spend just a few words? I know this is a huge issue, but military, one thing is military spending, one thing is having a common army. How would this be practically organized? Because at the end of the day, you have to decide who does what. And you cannot have, you know, a general, chief general that is German that tells the Italians what to do, or tells the French what to do. How I mean, I don't think there would be.
This is worth a separate seminar, but
Okay.
no, let me just make it easy and difficult at the same time with two words. Well, the first, it really depends on how much and in what way America abandons Europe. The worst scenario is that America exits from NATO, okay? In that case, the only way that Europe could hope to rapidly be able to defend itself is to take over NATO, okay? And let the Americans exit it, but merge it with the EU and imagine a position in which NATO Secretary General and the head of the European Commission are the same person.
Clear.
That's the only way. Within NATO, there are actually multinational commands. There are German generals giving orders to Italian colonels. This is the easy part.
Okay.
You would have to skip. If America does not exit NATO, but just weakens NATO, that's more of a problem because Europe will have to create this structure. And I will just spend a minute on it. The real question here is not about the army, it's about the nuclear deterrent, okay? If America does not offer a nuclear protection to Europe and Europe has to rely on its own, either we give European nuclear protection to the French deterrent, which is a huge political problem, or we create a European deterrent, a more modern one, because we're not talking about 1960s technology like the French deterrent, perhaps a more modernized type of nuclear arsenal, but it will become even more of a political problem on who has the finger on the button, okay? But it will be a huge push, a huge demand for it if the red situation happens, okay? The yellow and the green are more mixed, okay? I actually believe that it's slightly more likely that Trump wins than that Putin wins. So in terms of probability, I think a likely scenario for next year would be a green situation, which is not as bad as the worst case scenario, but it's challenging because Europe needs really big pushes from the outside, need really big threats in order to react, like it did post-COVID. Otherwise, I believe that the less active commission that Erik and Catherine have described is likely, okay? If not extreme scenarios happen, but sort of average scenarios, then there will be some inertia over the next commission. This is my take. I have tried to be as quick as possible and as synthetic.
No, this is super. Can I ask you, Filippo, a little bit more on, maybe someone else wants to step in as well on this, on the problem of enlargement and, you know, the reform of the EU that inevitably is necessary to bring at least Ukraine and maybe some other. So how do we approach that?
Okay, there is certainly a tension between enlargement and deepening. The more you enlarge Europe, the less cohesive, the less integrated it becomes. On the other hand, enlargement is a form of foreign policy. Not enlarging would require a much more effective deterrent to be effective against Russia. Because it would have to have military credibility of defending a country which is not within the European Union. You would have an extended deterrence, which is much more costly than defending your own borders. It's much less credible than defending your own borders. So enlargement may actually be a compromise, as Erik highlighted, meaning that Europe will not be able to be strong enough to protect Ukraine from the outside, and will therefore enlarge as a form of foreign policy, okay, as an alternative. which might actually not be the ideal solution, but it's politically likely, because it is not easy for Europe to gain strategic autonomy. To give you one indication, last year, for all the talk about European integration, all the new agencies like the European Defence Agency, of the 240 billion euros of the defense budget in all European countries, which only a fifth goes into actual investment, of that fifth, only a fifth went into European projects. And 4/5 of budgets in 2021, 2022 go to national or American. Okay, the figure is exactly the same as 20 years ago, meaning in the last 20 years, despite all the rhetoric, the actual transnational European defense industry is exactly the same level it was 20 years ago. Okay, to give an indication of how difficult it is to get forward in this.
By transnational, you mean agreement across countries on specific?
Like the Typhoon airplane,
Okay.
or the Airbus airplanes, the platforms built by more than one European country. One key indication of this is that last month, Italy's aerospace industry, Leonardo, made an agreement for the next future aircraft with the British and the Japanese, did not join the European consortium made by France, Germany, and Spain. Okay, so there is a lot of talk about you know, the European defense industry strategy, but not yet any policy.
Thank you, Filippo. Let's open up the discussion. And, you know, Filippo, can you leave your 4 scenarios on? Because actually I wanted to follow up with Erik and Catherine on that one. If you can actually put in the presentation mode, that would be great. So the first thing that strikes me about this is that there is no a column and a row for the results of the European elections. So this is just what happens in the United States and what happened in Ukraine, which comes back to my initial question to Catherine, is why, I mean, there is not much discussion about the outcome of the European election, and there is so much more discussion about the US election, and probably also rightly so of the Ukraine war. So 2 questions for both Erik and Catherine, maybe in this order. First, what do you think about what Filippo said about the enlargement and in general to Ukraine? And second, which one of the 4 scenarios that are on display with the colors you think is the most likely? Filippo said he believes in the green one as being the most likely. I want to pick your brain on which one do you think is most likely. Erik, you can go first.
First, I usually enjoyed Filippo's presentation. I thought that was very helpful. I think this way of packaging the scenarios is a useful thought experiment. Look, I think it's much more likely that Biden wins than that Trump wins, for the way that the actual swing voters are moving, particularly in the suburban areas. But I think it's useful as a political tool to focus people's minds on the need to mobilize to vote for Biden. So I'm gonna embrace that pessimistic outcome. And second, I don't think either Ukraine or Russia is going to prevail in this conflict, and that's the thing that scares me. So I would love to hear Filippo give us a clearer sense of what happens if we end up with a frozen line of contact that has real kinetic violence going across it on an ongoing basis. Because I think Filippo's point about enlargement is exactly the point I would make. It's a very cogent analysis. But I just don't ever see us stabilizing the line of contact between Russia and Ukraine. And it's certainly not going to get to a place where either of those 2 parties is satisfied.
Filippo, do you want to answer to this, follow up on this?
No, certainly, in the rows, there must be a decision, meaning a hung America is impossible for the electoral rules, so somebody will win. There is, in fact, a middle column, which is some kind of what is going on right now, some kind of stalemate, but a bloody stalemate. Because if it is a frozen stalemate, then there is an option of enlargement. If it is, of course, a bloody stalemate with thousands of casualties a day, I doubt that that would happen. So certainly, I agree with Erik that that is what is happening now, a stalemate. And of course, stalemates are not stable necessarily. You can have a white swan, which is Ukraine prevailing, or a black swan, which is, of course, Russia prevailing. But certainly, it's a good point. Still, I'm brought by my profession to be dichotomic, and this is why I came up with this matrix, which is a little bit of a nightmarish matrix, but for the purposes of the seminar, it seemed right.
It's very helpful. Yeah, it's very helpful. Catherine, do you want to step in?
Yes, sure. I mean, I have to say that I was going to say I would tend to fall more into the yellow corner, but I also don't think that anyone will prevail in that conflict for the short to medium term, and therefore we need a box about protracted or frozen conflict. I just wanted to say just a couple things on enlargement, and that is that I think that, as Erik said, I mean, this is going to be one of the dominant themes, and how it's going to be handled in the next commission is absolutely key. And here I would say that, I think for some, enlargement is about, a way of doing foreign policy. It's about, getting a step closer to Europe as a geopolitical power, stepping up its responsibilities, developing its capacities for strategic autonomy, etc. It's a foreign policy step. I think for others, it is a way also of fundamentally rethinking the logic of Europe in terms of its treaties, especially in terms of voting and moving to different kinds of voting, qualified majority voting, in a sense, a way to catch up with some of the to overcome some of the dysfunctionalities that are the product of a Europe of the 27 already. But I think that both of these, while not wrong, they're still in this mode where enlargement is a kind of, we think about it as the next wave of enlargement. And actually, I think we're talking about something really quite fundamentally different here in terms of, first of all, essentially having to think of this rather than as an enlargement, really as a much deeper transformation of the European Union than that.
That sounds as a super difficult task, to change the voting rules, just as an example. And
I'm not actually.
Maybe I'm wrong.
Sorry, I mean, I think that, some people are putting it forward, saying that, without this kind of treaty change, there can be no enlargement because the size of the union would become unwieldy and it would contain the seeds of its own dysfunction, if you like. But in a sense, I'm not arguing in favor of that. I suppose what I'm saying is that, we tend to see this as the next logical step. We had a first wave of enlargement, a second wave of enlargement. Here comes another wave of enlargement. And I actually do think that this is qualitatively different, and that we need to think of it as a much more fundamental transformation. And we need to think about it beyond these treaty changes, a foreign policy instrument, and so on and so forth. And actually, also come to terms with the fact that it's a real shift in the vision of what the European Union would be, what its function is. That seems fundamental to me, rather than think it's just the next wave. It might be practical, but it's unrealistic.
So thank you so much. I mean, you have draw a very big picture of all the things. Let me, since we have a few minutes, before concluding, I want to ask you, a couple of questions. First of all, in this scenario, do you see any risks, big risks, like, a crisis, some country not going ahead with the plan? That's the first question, because it seems that, it's a kind of kick the can down the road type of scenario, but without any major problem. Second, and I want brief answers from you. Second, it doesn't look like the projection, what you have described doesn't look like it's going to weaken very much Europe. Maybe it's going to be less on climate, more on defense, but there's going to be industrial policy, there's going to be thinking about how to manage the foreign issues. So maybe it's not that Europe as a it's not a real federation, but as an entity is going to be weakened by this process. So these are my two questions. Do you see any reasons for big crises ahead or risks in general? And do you see a weakening of the European institutions or not going forward? Quick.
I'll answer first also because I really have to go to another meeting.
Right,
so
sure.
I'm sorry that I will run a little early. The baseline scenario that we have described, all three of us, is of a Europe going sideways, not really forward. It's dangerous in itself, meaning a migration crisis, a financial crisis would actually cut deep inside the flesh of the European society. So implicitly, we have been quite pessimistic, I think, all three of us.
But Erik has been pretty bullish on the capital market union going ahead, the cross-border
without a crisis. But if there is a big financial crisis coming before that happens, I would like to hear whether he's optimistic about that, but I'm not.
Erik.
There are so many bad things that can happen. As for a capital markets union, bullish in the sense that I think they're going to put emphasis in that area. But we've been talking about capital markets union ever since Alberto Giovannini came up with his report in 1998, and we're still, it's like Brazil. It's project of the future and always will be. So and Filippo is absolutely right. If we have a real crisis right now, and a financial crisis would be the worst possible imaginable, because we're in that weird thing where we're not talking about the ESM and all this other stuff. If we have a financial crisis right now, then I think it will be a very awkward situation for Europe. I think it will be very damaging for the European project and will require every bit as much effort as we had to put in 2011 and 2012.
Catherine, what is your
I agree. I think, the past 5 years, Europe has built up a capacity for resilience. It's learned to flex different kinds of muscles that it didn't really know how to flex or even know that it had, before this last commission. And that's going to
sorry, Catherine. Sorry if I interrupt. Filippo, thanks for joining us. And I guess you have to go. Don't worry about that. And thank you so much for being with us for this webinar. Sorry, Catherine, please.
No, that's all right. That this resilience that we've built up, I think it's not. We can't think of it as money in the bank. That the job is done, right? We're only as good as our last crisis, and if we do go sideways, then I think we're going to see, potentially less resilience, and actually an unraveling of some of the acquis, right, that we've built up over the past 5 years. So that's why I don't think it's a particularly optimistic situation, but it would be even worse if we were tested by a severe financial crisis.
Sure. Since we're talking about economics, my take is that we have the ECB, which has learned a lot how to manage crises. So we might not be in such a bad position either. So, Erik, Catherine, thank you so much. This was wonderful. At least I've learned a tremendous amount of stuff. And so I want to thank you for being with us. I remind all our listeners that we have the quarterly economic outlook coming up on March 27th. So we will have a presentation of that online on March 27th from 11 to 1 p.m. And in the March edition, we look a little bit to a longer horizon up to 2030. And so we will discuss also possible risks, and your insights are going to be very useful for us to, describe scenarios that are realistic. So thank you so much, and
Thank you.
hope to see you in person very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.